want to start out by just playing off of the end of what you just said, Ambassador Freeman. I'm struck that, you know, we don't know yet who this putative savior is, who you mentioned, who's going to come make everything right again and turn things around. So I want to ask you, since we're talking about citizen engagement this weekend, how can we as engaged citizens become our own saviors and minimize the damage to the world order in the meantime?
Well, I don't think there's anything immediate that can be done to turn around what is a long process. But if you don't start, you'll never get anywhere. And I think the first thing is citizen participation. Over 40% of Americans don't vote. Apathy is the fundamental prop of a static, stagnant society. Those 40% of Americans, some of whom did turn out in the last election to vote for Mr. Trump out of disgust with the stagnation in the country, need to be mobilized and inspired. And I think, as I said, we need to begin to study at the citizen level foreign best practices. I have to say, every time I hear a Congress critter proclaim that a single-payer health insurance system cannot possibly work, I ask, how come it does in another 30 industrial democracies? Whether you like that as a solution or not, let's not start from a false premise as we consider the question. And I would say also, and picking up on something Thea said yesterday, that I look at industrial employment, which is a real problem. Less than 8% of American workers are now engaged in industry, manufacturing. If you look at Germany or Japan, you'll find it's somewhat more than 20%. Those societies are more automated than ours. This is counterintuitive. Why? What explains it? Well, if you go to Germany, labor unions have a seat on the management committee in corporations. So when the corporation faces pressure from competition, cheaper prices, perhaps better products, its response is not what American corporations usually do, which is to say, oh, we better lower labor costs by moving to Bangladesh. It is to say, to ask the question, how do we automate and retrain our existing workforce to be more competitive? We need to look at labor management relations in light of the experience of other countries. And the days when we can sit here in North America and imagine that we have all the answers and nobody else has any are long gone.
Let me ask you, again, playing off of that, in your speech, you used the phrase, you said, foreign policy is not about taking names, and that there's this dangerous trend towards machismo, and again, you referenced the Red Scare and McCarthyism and all of that. So specifically on the question of foreign policy, the taking names is obviously a reference to Nikki Haley, our UN ambassador, who said that anyone who voted against the United States wishes she'd be taking names and remembering them and acting against them, presumably. So instead of this punitive approach to foreign policy, which is sort of the thread that ran through your entire speech, that we impose rules on others that we don't ourselves obey, again, we're not the people in the positions of power here, but what can we do to possibly influence the Trump administration's foreign policy, which it sounds from your speech is going further down the road of bad policy that you have described?
Diplomacy is not just a strategic maneuver or the tactics of foreign policy. It is also risk management and the day-to-day management of a process which enlists others and encourages attitudes favorable to their cooperating with you. We are eviscerating our diplomatic establishment. Many, many positions that are important, some that are not important, are vacant. The presidential transition, which began in 2016 and supposedly should have been over last year, is entirely incomplete. We have a Secretary of State in an administration that is radically reducing expenditures on soft power I don't like that term, by the way, but let's say diplomacy, while ramping up expenditures for new nuclear weapons, just what we need. I don't think new nuclear weapons are going to do anything to gain us the cooperation of trading partners or encourage them to negotiate new rules with us that favor employment growth here as well as there. So I would argue, let's look at what's happening, see if we can penetrate the fog of falsehoods that now clog our media vision.
All right. I want all of you here in Camden and also in Rockland and Belfast and all the satellite locations to be thinking about your questions that you want to ask. So either write them down or signal to one of the mics. And I'm just going to ask one question of Natalie while you guys are getting ready with your questions. So Natalie, coming out of your talk, I guess I want to ask, you have a lot of personal experience in Russia. As a reporter, and you referenced our own situation here in the United States where there's an obsession with Russia, the Russia probe, how Russia interfered in our election, then 13 indictments on the individuals and the 3 entities. So give us the European perspective of how do you guys view Russia and its interference in our election?
The European picture on Russia is complex because there are different sensitivities within Europe to Russia as a neighbor. And, Poles don't relate to Russia and don't think about Russia in the same way that the French do, or certainly the Spanish, or, the British. There's a history that's different. There are very strong contrasts. But I think that by now, after what happened in 2014, which was the first changing of borders, unilateral changing of borders on the European continent through use of force with the annexation of Crimea, that was a tipping point. It wasn't just war that was coming back to Europe, it was that changing of borders through use of force. And that raised really big red flags in Europe. So since then, there's been a growing assessment that Russia is a revisionist power on the European continent. It wants to somehow rewrite some of the rules that were created in the post-war and then post-Cold War era. It's doing so in sometimes confusing ways. It's playing hot and cold sometimes, but I think that assessment is growing. So when you think about that, meddling in elections becomes slightly, it's an important thing. Okay, it needs to be documented. It needs to, everything needs to be, clarified and dealt with. But that particular question of Russian revisionism, as an assessment today that's fairly widely shared in Europe is the big overarching challenge.
Okay, and we need to get to questions, but I know Chaz wanted to jump in.
Very quickly, I agree with Natalie that the issue of Russian revisionism is the central question. But I would like to point out that Ukraine and Crimea were not the first change of borders by violence. That was Kosovo. There was no UN authorization for that, and it was a direct challenge to Russian interests, and I think it had something to do with inspiring the Russians in Crimea. A broader point, what question you ask determines what answers you consider. If the question is how to prevent Russia from fooling around in our sphere of influence, how to push our borders up to Russia's, how to ensure that Ukraine is on our side, then you get one set of responses. If the question is a different one, illustrated by history, for example, 1815, revolutionary France is defeated. The victors very sensibly convene the Congress of Vienna, and they reincorporate France into the councils of government in Europe. They make it part of the system. And for 100 years, there's very little war in Europe until 1914. World War I finishes, and the victors do something quite different. They exclude Germany from a role in participating in European affairs, and they allow the Bolshevik regime in Moscow to exclude itself. So that didn't work out very well. It caused World War II. It led directly to the Cold War. So perhaps we should be asking a different question with regard to Russia. How do we incorporate Russia into a positive role in governing a common space? How do we make Ukraine a viable state that is both a buffer and a bridge between Russia and the rest of Europe? How do we deal with Russia, not how do we exclude Russia? If you ask those questions, you begin to look at other answers. And I think it wouldn't be a bad idea to reframe some of the questions we're asking ourselves.
We could have an entire conference on NATO expansionism and how NATO expansionism may have encouraged Russia. I know you want to jump in, but we also want to get to questions. So I'm going to prevail upon the audience to please be generous by making your questions brief, and I'll ask our speakers to make their answers pithy so we can try to get as many people as possible. All right, let's start here. All right. Yes, we just called on one person in the audience, so we'll get her question and then we'll go to the screen.
With the goal of working toward, a workable electing a functional Congress, in both identifying, some common grounds and some unholy alliances, whatever. How does pushing for things I happen to believe in, like single payer or gun control, how does pursuing those goals, will it help to unify or further divide this, our government?
Depends on who we elect and whether they are committed to making our constitutional system work or not. We do not have a parliamentary system. In a parliamentary system, winner takes all and can ignore the opposition. That is not the way a separation of powers government works. We have to compromise across the aisle. Everyone who votes for someone who says, I will never compromise, is contributing to gridlock. So my answer is we need to go back to representative government in which representatives are expected to exercise independent judgment in accordance with the broad will of the people. We need to restore the Constitution, by the way. Article 1, Section 8, Clause 11, very deliberately assigned the power to launch wars of choice to the US Congress. The president does not have that constitutional authority. And yet we're now engaged in 9 wars, all of them presidentially proclaimed. We have a Bill of Rights, some of which is apparently in suspense. We need to restore our traditional values. And that, I think, gets to this next question.
Yeah, let's get that question, which was from one of our satellite locations. Norman Rapkin in Portland wants to know, how can the U.S. regain the international stature it had years ago? Natalie, start us off briefly with the answer from a European point of view, and I think you also wanted to add something about reframing the question on Russia.
I would say the first thing is to get back into multilateralism, to say that, the U.S. wants to reach out to partners and work together and break away from this sense that it is going alone, so it is going it alone somehow.
But let me challenge you on that.
Yeah.
During 8 years of the Obama administration, we were supposedly reaching out to our multilateral partners, and the premise of this question is the stature we had years ago, which I take to mean that the questioner does not think we had that stature during the Obama administration. So does the multilateralism that the Obama administration engaged in, is that really just the answer?
Well, it was a big part of the answer, yeah. Think back at where the U.S.'s image was in 2008. Its image had been damaged. Chas mentioned Guantanamo. In Europe, the image of the USA had been severely damaged by a lot of things. Iraq, Guantanamo, a lot of things.
Of course,
so I think
the Obama administration did not shut down Guantanamo.
No, it didn't,
still exists.
and everything's complex because, having said that, as a European, yes, we criticize Guantanamo, but remember, European governments, some of them were involved in those networks of CIA.
The black sites.
In Poland, namely in Lithuania. So it's a complex picture. Going back just 1 second on Kosovo, but this can be a long conversation. I do think there's a big difference between Kosovo and Crimea. Kosovo was the settlement that happened in Kosovo in 1999 was the result of an intervention which was a multilateral intervention, lots of countries involved, and that followed an attempt to negotiate and to settle the question of the behavior of Milosevic's troops in Kosovo. There were UN resolutions in the run-up to that last negotiating attempt in Rambouillet outside Paris in March of 1999, and it's the failure of that last negotiating stretch that led to the intervention. So there was a multilateral framework around the question of Kosovo. That said, Chas is right that there was no explicit UN resolution authorizing use of force, but there was a whole build-up, including the UN, on this issue of Kosovo. Why? Because Bosnia had happened before that. You can't think about Kosovo without what happened before.
Right. Okay, let's take one more question from one of the satellite locations, and I just want to remind everyone, you will have a chance to ask questions of Natalie and Chaz in the final group panel. So Lisa Dalton of Rockland wants to know, what are Turkey's chances of joining the EU? Okay, so quick response from both of you. First you, Natalie, since you're
zero.
Smack dab in the middle.
Right now, zero.
Okay, that's a quick answer.
I agree.
All right, that gives us time. That gives us time for one more question. Well done, folks. All right, one more question. Should we take one more here? Okay, there's one right up there in the balcony.
Hi, John Campo, University of Maine. And Natalie, you seem to suggest that the Obama administration made a mistake in Syria. And I was just wondering, considering our failures in Iraq and Libya and the regains of the Taliban in Afghanistan, how would Syria be different?
I think the short answer is that all these situations are different. And one of the difficulties we have today in getting our minds around these issues is seeing those complexities and seeing those differences. In fact, every single case of an intervention is a specific case. I think it's hard, and we haven't, we need to try to go back on how things happened and not lump everything together. The fact that outcomes weren't those that were expected, whether we intervened or did not intervene, does not lead to the automatic conclusion that any intervention is always a complete failure. I think Bosnia is an example of a place where intervention did play a role. I think Rwanda and Syria today, in different contexts, are examples where failure to act at the right time in a smart way led to huge amounts of human suffering and regional destabilization. So probably I don't have time to get into the details, but I think there are differences between Libya and and Syria, just as there are differences between Afghanistan and remember, Iraq is almost a very specific case because this was a land invasion. No authorization whatsoever by the UN Security Council. So Iraq kind of, as Chas said, it kind of broke that taboo of. It was like the first moment where the US was blatantly acting against rules that it itself had contributed to build up. And Iraq is definitely a turning point. But don't lump all these interventions, as we look back to the 90s, into a single bag. It's a more complex thing. I think that there was an opportunity in Syria. It's my belief. I think there was an opportunity in Syria in the summer of 2013 to do something that might have led to a negotiated solution.
Through diplomatic led or using force in some way? I
don't see. What I said is through targeted through targeted strikes. The opposition.
After the red line was crossed.
The opposition in Syria in the summer of 2013 was in a much better place than it was later. That doesn't mean there was going to be military regime change with people invading, the presidential palace in Damascus and U.S. Marines landing. That was never the plan. When the people from the Obama administration are slightly disingenuous when I listen to them still today, saying, well, there's no way we're going to repeat Iraq. That was never the plan in Syria. And so I think that at that moment when the Assad regime was still in the early phases of that war, it's been going on for 2 years by that time, might have been pushed towards the negotiating table. The Russians were almost out of the picture. They're involved they're tightly connected to the Syrian regime. And they have been for decades, but they were out of the picture as active military actors on the ground.
Chaz, quick word to close us out.
Very quickly, I think the mistake on the red line with chemical weapons, if indeed chemical weapons were actually used, was just to draw a red line. This is very stupid because basically what we did was we incentivized somebody to use chemical weapons to justify our bombing of the Syrian regime, which they wanted us to bomb. And I happened to have been in Damascus the end of March, early April 2011, when all this began, and it was very striking. First of all, it wasn't an unarmed, peaceful demonstration. There was firing. Second, there were many external actors who were supplying weapons to the Syrian opposition, made no secret of their desire to overthrow the regime, the government. And the United States immediately came out and supported the overthrow of the Assad government. So I think we have quite dirty hands in Syria.
I disagree with that.
Yeah, I know you do.
We can have another debate about Syria later, but I will say on the narrow point of the chemical weapon use, the United Nations and all of the investigations have established that there was chemical weapon use, and we can argue about
there was.
who did it and whatever.
That's the key.
But I don't think anyone's accusing the United States of having done it. So at least our hands are clean on that.
Chemical weapons were dropped by helicopters in Syria. I don't think the opposition had helicopters flying.